They told you Africa was discovered, but nothing that was already watching the stars, measuring seasons, naming power, and negotiating the invisible could ever be discovered. So here is the question that unsettles historians and comforts myths. What if Africa was not misunderstood by accident? What if it was misunderstood on purpose? Because misunderstanding is not ignorance, it is a strategy. Africa was never silent. It was simply speaking a language the world refused to learn. Before borders were drawn with rulers and ink, authority here did not sit on thrones alone. It moved, it breathed, it listened. Power was not always centralized. In many societies, it was distributed, between elders and youth, between visible leaders and invisible guardians, between the living and the ancestral. A chief could rule land, but not time. A king could command armies, but not memory. And memory was sacred. Africa understood something modern systems still struggle to accept, that leadership without spiritual legitimacy collapses, and power without communal consent rots from within. So when outsiders arrived asking, "Who is in charge here?" they were asking the wrong question. They were looking for crowns. Africa was pointing to councils. They were seeking titles. Africa was revealing responsibilities. That confusion would later be recorded as lack of structure. Consider this quietly unsettling truth. Much of what was labeled as primitive was simply untranslatable. Time, for example, was not always linear. It was relational. The past stood beside the present. The unborn were already accounted for. Justice was not punishment-focused. It was restorative. The goal was not to isolate the offender, but to heal the fracture in the community. Knowledge was not hoarded in books. It was stored in people, in proverbs, in rituals, in songs, sung only at the right moment by the right voice. To outsiders, this looked like superstition. But superstition does not survive for thousands of years across deserts, forests, savannas, and rivers. Systems do. Here is the layer most narratives avoid. Africa was not misunderstood because it lacked complexity. It was misunderstood because its complexity threatened imported hierarchies. You cannot easily dominate a people whose power is not concentrated in one place. You cannot erase a worldview that does not depend on written permission to exist. You cannot fully conquer a society where identity is collective and resilience is ritualized. So the story had to be simplified. Kings became tyrants. Spiritual systems became witchcraft. Communal land became unused. Oral knowledge became unreliable. Once simplified, Africa could be explained. Once explained, it could be managed. Once managed, it could be extracted from. That is how misunderstanding becomes infrastructure. And this is why it still matters. Today, Africa is often judged using borrowed metrics: productivity without context, governance without culture, progress without memory. Young Africans are told to modernize by forgetting, to lead by imitating, to succeed by distancing themselves from what made their societies endure in the first place. Yet beneath the noise, something remains. You see it in how community still absorbs failure, in how elders are consulted even when ignored, in how spirituality survives behind modern titles, in how identity refuses to become purely individual. Africa is not behind, it is layered, and layered civilizations are always misunderstood by those trained to see only surfaces. So here is the final thought that lingers longer than comfort allows. If Africa is still misunderstood, it is not because the world lacks information. It is because understanding Africa requires unlearning the habit of superiority and learning to listen without needing to control. The question is no longer why Africa is misunderstood. The question is whether the world is finally ready to understand something it was never meant to dominate.